All right, everyone. So we are going to take a look at the biology and biochemistry question pack, volume 1, passage number 14. This is a passage that covers genetics, specifically X-linked genetics. So I actually like this. It's a tough passage. It really requires you to understand your genetics, understand X-linked disorders, and then really critically reason through a couple of tricky questions that we'll hopefully do together. So step one, let's just go ahead and read. We're just going to use the same approach that we do. And what I want to point out before we actually start is that this type of passage is usually, these shorter passages can be very tricky at times in the sense that they may seem very light and seem as if you can quickly breeze through them, but I do encourage all students to, especially the shorter ones, slow down, read carefully, because they're oftentimes trying to pack a lot over a small amount of space. So with that, let's get into it. So I'll just go ahead and read out loud and sort of give you guys an insight into how I read. So we start off, so several species, Drosophila, okay, some flies, have keyword X-linked. That's important. X-linked E and F genes. Great. So I'm just going to highlight that, and they affect the sex ratios. It's interesting. So we see, however, and I personally like to just stop and note anytime I see any pivot words or any transition words, because it oftentimes gives you an idea of how a full thought is put together. So in this sentence here, in these two sentences, it's really two thoughts, right? So there's these flies that have these X-linked gene, E and F. However, right, the genes only affect the sex ratio if they are brought close together by an inversion of one arm, right? So that's telling us that there's these two genes that are X-linked, and on their own, they'd be considered just standard genes. But if you notice how far away they are in the standard, what happens this is the mutant version of it here. So this would be the mutant. They term it XF, the inverted X, because the E and F are now closer together. And we're calling this the mutant because, as the second half of the first sentence stated, that the negative consequences of having the E and F genes only mattered if the two genes were really close. All right, so with that, let's kind of move on to the second paragraph. The second paragraph begins by first defining the standard version of a male, who, if we take a look here, is a male that has the standard X gene and a normal Y gene. Okay, so with that, let's actually just take a quick pause and think about some very basics of X-linked genetics. So I personally always like to think about the males as the starting point whenever I think of X-linked diseases, because it oftentimes is very easy to understand the dominance of the phenotype associated with any X-linked mutation in males because they only have one X, right? And so there's two parts to really understanding how this clue can help you to answer any X-linked question. So for me, what that tells me is this individual has only two sex alleles. We all know that, right? But then remember that in the process of meiosis, you're going from a 2N, 4C, all the way down to a 1N, 1C cell, right? And so what that means then is, sorry, that was start off as a 2N, 2C organism, and then you turn on and become a 1N, 1C. So what that has to do with these sex alleles is that when the individual goes to procreate, right, a male can either do one of two things. They can give an X or they can give a Y. Therefore, there's a 50% chance of a male who has a condition transferring that condition over to an offspring who is female. That's the key part to remember. Why is that important? Because we have to always remember the sex chromosomes, right? The X that is provided by the male only goes to the female. So if, for example, this male was an XF, right, the mutant gene associated with the sex ratios discussed in paragraph 1, that male would have a 50% chance of passing that gene along to a female offspring. However, a 0% chance of passing along to a male offspring. Now that we've talked about the progression of a male individual siring offspring, let's talk about the other side, right? Let's talk about how this individual got their 2 alleles, right? If they have a Y, we already know where that Y had to have come from. It had to have come from their father. However, it's important to also note that their father had an X, which we actually don't know the status of. Because remember, again, the father had a 50% chance of passing on either one of those alleles to his offspring, but he had a 100% chance of passing that allele on to his male offsprings because they are XY. And the Y, again, remember, comes from the dad. So we can then realize and conclude then that the female, the mother in this case, has to be the one that passed along any X-linked mutant gene to a male offspring, which means either one of these alleles, right, or both. So one or both might be a mutant. And I like to make sure I always stop and think about the full set of genotypes that might be associated with a specific phenotype or genotype I'm interested in order to make sure that I don't forget, for example, the fact that a heterozygous female, right, so that would be a female that is XS, XF, right, so they're standard on one allele and mutant on one allele. This is a woman that can actually transfer this affected allele to both males and females. Okay? So with that, let's go ahead and transition. And now we're going to actually just refocus briefly on the female. Right? So we have females are XX. So if this female, right, is expressing a heterozygous or a recessive gene, right? That means that one of them is obviously a standard and the other one has to be the one that's mutant, right? So we're gonna do the same exercise and think about the offspring that this woman can have, right? Unlike the male, women can pass either one of their X alleles to their offsprings, right? They can pass it to the female, obviously, who's gonna end up being XX, one from the mother, one from the father, but they can also be able to pass that X along to the male, who obviously will get their Y from their father and the X from the mother. So either one of these alleles that a woman has a 50% chance of being passed to the offspring. Right? Now keep in mind, we did not gender the offspring here. We just said that they have a 50% chance of passing it along to their offspring because they have 2 alleles, 50% chance of passing either one on, right? So now that we've talked about their offspring, we'll do the same exact exercise we did before. We're going to take a step back and think about a female that has a mutant X allele. Where did that come from, right? So there's 2 possibilities. It could have come from dad, it could have come from mom. Right? So let's start with the dad side. The dad side's almost the easiest because you just have to ask yourself, is dad symptomatic? Right? If not symptomatic, another word obviously is, does he express the phenotype of interest? Because we know dad has one Y. So for the daughter to have gotten it from the dad had to have had it. That's the only way he can pass an X chromosome to his daughter that actually has the affected disease. And that again is because he only has one to pass. Now, on the other hand, if the father lacked the phenotype, right? So if the father was normal, right? We know the father is X and Y. That means that the father had to have given his daughter the X chromosome. We know that because the daughter has 2 X's. One came from mom, the other one came from dad. So if the dad is fine, obviously the X that he gave his daughter was okay. Now, on the other hand, if we come here to mom, she must have the disease. If the daughter has it and the dad does not express any phenotype. So with that brief detour, let's get back to the passage. Right? So what they're going to proceed to do in this next paragraph, the second paragraph, is they're going to just kind of give us a brief description of the phenotypes that we're going to talk about in this passage. And again, the first genotype is the standard Y male, right? So it's a male who has a normal X chromosome, right? Which tells us again that the mother has to be one of two things. She has to be XSXS, so that is homozygous dominant, or she may be XSXF, but had passed on the good allele, that good 50%. Now, I'll keep saying these numbers because it's important for you to, as you're listening through, to keep paying attention to these key percentages and the logic behind how we're able to say those statements about either genotypes or phenotype. Because this exercise of thinking things through ultimately is what the MCAT is really looking to test you on any complicated either pedigree or X-linked or any non-Mendelian genetics problem that they provide you. They really want to see you kind of logically think through a set of facts within the context of a genetics problem, which is what we're going to do as we move on next. All right, so we've seen that they've got the standard, and it looks like the other gene is the ratio gene. Okay, so now that we've picked up on what these genes look like, let's look at the phenotype, right? So it looks like the standard phenotype is just going to make a set of equal male and female, whereas the mutant version is only going to have daughters. And one more thing I like to again point out as I'm talking, I try to avoid using the term XF or XS, right? Simply because, as I've mentioned to many of you, working memory is an important part of this exercise of taking an MCAT passage. And it is really important that you make sure that you code what's written on the passage in the easiest way for you to remember. And so for me, the standard X is just simply normal. The inverted X is simply the mutant. And by doing that, it helps me just keep myself organized and avoid the MCAT fog, as I often say. All right, so now let's finish up the paragraph. And oftentimes with genetics questions that are difficult, it's usually the phrase that's towards the end of a paragraph or after a comma that tends to really, really challenge you, right? So always make sure that I kind of carefully read the last part, right? And what it's basically telling us is, look, the number of children that either one of these varieties of flies has is the same. The only difference is the ratio of them. Now, last paragraph, last two paragraphs, sorry. If none of the mutant carrying genotypes, if none of the flies carrying a mutant allele, right? So that would be either the males that have a mutant allele, the females that are homozygous, or the females that are heterozygous, okay? And if they are selected against, if none of them are selected against, right, then it says that the frequency of XF is expected to increase to 100%, right? And it tells us unless other genes act to suppress expression of E and F, right? So far, I'm not really sure what that means. And in the last sentence, occasionally, males can sire viable, males with the F or the mutant allele, which remember, if you had a mutant allele, you could only sire daughters, but it says that there's times where they're able to sire men or males, but these males are often sterile, but normal appearing. And genetic analysis shows that these men are X not, right? So they're missing their Y, lacking a Y. Okay, so we've done a lot of reading, so why don't we just go ahead and try our hand at a couple questions and see how we do. Okay, so let's start off. So if all genotypes are equally fit, all genotypes equally fit, and if there's no genetic modifiers of the sex ratio trait, what will be the fate of the population in which 50% of the X chromosomes are currently XF, and 50% of the chromosomes are XS. All right? It's a very, very challenging question. So let's take a look at it. So first and foremost, right, I always encourage you to try and restate the question to yourself, right? So what I'm seeing in this question, it's basically telling me if what was stated in the passage did not occur and the frequency, so that does not occur, right? Meaning that if there are no other genes to suppress the expression of EF, right? Another way of saying that is, I'm going to highlight this in red so we can kind of see the difference, right? In this third paragraph, they told us that if you had no outside intervention, you would expect that the mutant gene would end up reaching 100% frequency. And if we look at the question, that kind of is sort of mirrored in the question. It basically says if all genotypes are equally fit, right, and there's no genetic modifiers to the sex ratio, right, what's going to happen to a population that started off at 50% X and 50% XF and 50% normal X? Okay, so let's think this through. If you don't have anything modifying the E and F gene, what's going to happen? Your frequency of the XF is basically going to reach 100%. All right, so that far we've got so far, right? So now let's think about what that's going to mean for our population, right? Where do those XF sit? Obviously, those sit in a female, great, but then they also fit in a male. Interesting. So let's kind of look at the questions, and it's asking us basically what's going to happen to our population stability, basically. So we look here and we say, okay, these females, right? All their offsprings have to have that mutant allele. There's a 100% chance that those females are going to have that mutant allele. And there's also a 100% chance that those females are going to have another mutant allele. Because again, remember, ladies and gentlemen, that when you are a male, you always transfer your singular X to the female. So there's a 100% chance that your daughter has an X that you gave her. So now we've gotten the female side. Now let's look at the male side. We know mom is obviously going to give a defective chromosome, and we know dad's going to give the Y chromosome. So we then have to pause here, because one thing that students often do is they forget to stay in the passage. We've done a lot of critical reasoning. We've kind of read through some genetics, right? But it's important to stay within the passage. And what I mean by that is when we finally are walking through this little set of steps that I had us doing on the right side, right? It's important to remember what the passage was really about. The passage was about the consequences of a mutant X allele on the sex ratios. Specifically, the way in which male who had a specific X allele would produce offsprings of different ratios depending on whether or not they had or did not have the mutant allele. So we really don't actually have to stop and think as much about the male offsprings. It's really these men, because that's really what the passage is about. And if we come back here and ask ourselves, okay, these men that have a mutant X and a normal Y, what's the ratio of offspring they're going to have? And what you find out is that the men that have the mutant offspring always produce 100% females, right? Now, this is crucial because remember, the question asked us, what happens if you get to a position where the X chromosome, 100% of the alleles that are around are the mutant allele? And what we basically said is that you're going to end up in a situation where the males always produce a female. Now, if you haven't picked up on it, the female cannot produce a male on their own. They need the Y from the man. So we're essentially talking about here a society that's eventually going to get to 100% female society. Why is that? 100% of the alleles in this population, 100% allele frequency, is represented by the mutant, which means that all men in the population have to have the mutant gene, or allele, sorry, and all females in the population have to have it. These men can only make females. These women, because they only have X alleles, can only ever contribute an X to the situation. So if the men can't add a Y to the situation, and the women can only add an X, we end up in a population that only has females. In other words, we risk extinction. Okay. So let's go ahead and try question number 2. All right, so in a laboratory population, all males that were normal, all right, among the females rather, 15% had the heterozygous or homozygous version, and 50% were heterozygous, and 50% or 35% lacked the allele that would cause them to have female, would have the mutant allele, sorry. So let me just redraw that, right? So we know that we have 15% of our women in this population are the homozygous recessive. 35% in the population are homozygous dominant. And then 50% are going to end up being heterozygous. And we also know that they told us that all the males have the standard allele. So next we have to ask ourselves, what's the question asking us? The question's asking us, right, what proportion of all male flies in this next generation will be X, Y? Okay. So we know that the man, right, is going to just produce a Y. So we actually don't need to think about this side of things. Because remember what the question's asking us. It's really, really important to listen or read the question and understand what the question's asking us. It's basically saying, if I mate a male that does not have the allele that we're concerned about, with a female that is any one of these on the right side, what is the probability of my offsprings having the mutant allele? Right? So one simple way of doing it is, let's just do a simple cross match, right? So you can say, okay, let's take this male, cross him with this female, right? What are the odds of you making a male that has the disease? It's 100%. Why is that? We again said that the male is always going to be giving the Y, so we only have to think about the mom. When we think about the mom, that mom right there, that 15%, is going to obviously give the mutant. So you can go ahead and add and say, okay, cool. If there's a 100% chance of this genotype producing an offspring with the mutant allele in it, it's the same thing as saying that there's a 15% chance that the offspring male population is going to have that allele. Because every single one of the women in this population that had both the mutant alleles had a 100% chance of passing that allele on to their offspring. So if we're using numbers, if we had 15 women and they went on and had one son each, you would end up with 15 sons that had the mutant allele, all right? So if we just stop and just kind of think about the rest of this, all right? So we look at, let's go to the other extreme, right? Let's look at this version here when you do not have the mutant allele. So we know that you would have 0% chance of producing a offspring that had the allele that's mutant and did not have the allele that was mutant. All right, so that leaves us with this last one here. And so we have to think about it, and we know that the other offspring is going to get, the offspring is going to get the Y from the male. And the question is, what are the probabilities of this offspring getting an X that's mutated? Well, the mom has two X's. One of those is mutated, which means that the offspring now has a 50% chance of getting a mutant allele. So if we're talking about the population level statistics, we would then say that there's a 25% chance of a female that is heterozygous for the allele of interest and represents 50% of the total population of females. That situation leads to a 25% chance of the offspring having the mutant allele. So numbers sometimes are easier. If you had 50 women, all of whom were XF and SS, right? You have a 50% chance of passing on the mutant allele, which then tells you that of those 50 women, right, the expected number of offsprings with the allele would be 25. Okay? So now that we've done all that, all we have to do now is do a simple math problem and say, okay, of the offsprings that were created, how many of them led to a situation in which the offspring male, right? You got to remember what the question asked. It asked us about the offsprings that were male. How many of those actually ended up having the mutant allele? What we find out is we have 15% and 35% based on the two genotypes of the females. And so that adds up to, if I believe my math is not incorrect, 40. Because again, the women that were XF, right? They had a 100% chance of passing the XF allele. But remember, they started off only as 15% of the population. So if you are 15% of the population, the percentage of the offsprings that you're liable to create, 15% of the offsprings, 15% of the offsprings in the next generation are going to come from you, right? Assuming, you know, all the different genotypes produce females at the same rate, which I believe they do. In that case, you'd have to multiply this by 100%, which are the odds of getting a mutant allele. And again, remember, that's how we get the 15. And we did something very similar in order to get right? Okay, let's see. Got that one right. Okay, let's try this one. All right, so which of the following statements best explains why the mutant allele has the potential to increase to 100% in the gene pool that contains it? Okay, so let's think about it, right? So how does the gene get passed along, right? It's an X gene. So it can really honestly ever go from a woman to either a man who gets 1 or to a woman. And it can go from a man over to a woman. I like this because it kind of helps me understand the way in which X chromosomes are distributed. So let's remember again what the phenotype associated with having the mutant form of this was. It meant that you could only have offsprings. Okay? So if you can only have offsprings, and the question's asking us, okay, how do you end up with this gene, this mutant gene, being 100% of the gene pool, right? Remember, only female offspring. I think I might have misspoken. So for this question, why don't we actually try and go through and simply use some question answering techniques that might be helpful. So for me, I typically like to start by kind of doing a quick look at the question, and what I initially noticed is if you take a look here, these two answer choices, structurally, to me, seem very, very, very similar, given the fact that they have essentially a lot of the same words in them, with a couple different changes in them. So I'm going to simply point that out because oftentimes that could be a simple clue that helps you just zone in on where in a 2x2 answer choice you might need to go. It doesn't necessarily mean this is something that you can do all the time and get it right, but it's great to have a few different tips and tricks that you can apply. So let's go ahead and jump in and take a look here, right? So let's take a look at C. So when you have both of the mutant alleles, and that would be a female. So a female will pass the X chromosome to all their offsprings. Let's kind of take a look here and see. The female, if she had both of her alleles in that manner, right? What does that say about her? This is a very, very crucial thing to remember, right? If she looks like that, that means that she has 100% odds of passing the mutant chromosome. So if we start off there and remember that unlike the males, the females actually do pass their allele on to both men, or to both men and women. And so what that tells us is if you end up with the mutant inside of a woman, right? That woman can pass it on to her daughter and any sons that she has. Those sons can then pass any mutant allele onto their daughter. Why? Again, because there's a 100% chance that a man is going to pass his X chromosome to his daughter. He only has one. The Y goes to the males. The X goes to the females. I'm going to keep repeating this because it's a very, very simple fact that's central to understanding X-linked genetics. So back to the question. If the woman has both mutant alleles, she's going to pass it to all of her offsprings. That seems true. Now let's look at D, right? So I don't actually read past the comma because I noticed that I looked at what looked like a 2x2. Not really a 2x2, but kind of. These two answer choices are basically mirrors of each other. The only difference is they switched from a homozygous recessive to the male, is all they did. So let's read the second half of it, right? So it says that the male XY is going to pass their X chromosome to all their offsprings. We come back and look at our question, or our drawing, and we realize that can't be true. Because like I said a second ago, men only have one X chromosome, which they can then only pass along to their female offsprings, okay? So I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and pause. Let's see, are there any more questions that are difficult? Okay, let's actually work through this one. This one is a good one, okay? So you have a virgin female who mates and produces 34 daughters and 34 sons. Each of the 18 of the sons sire only daughters, all right? So let's stop there. That tells us that these sons have what kind of phenotype? They must have the mutant and they must have the male chromosome. We know they have a male because we know they have the Y because they're male, and we know they have that mutant chromosome because they only had daughter cells or daughters as offsprings, right? So we read the rest of it and it tells us that, okay, the remainder are going to sire equal number of daughters and sons. So that tells us that the rest of those have XS and Y. And remember, all of these offsprings have the same mother. That's very important to remember they have the same mother, right? The reason being is, remember, women have two chromosomes that are on two X chromosomes, I'm sorry. So they have a 50% chance of passing along either one of them. Now, if you're heterozygous, that makes a lot of sense. If you're homozygous, obviously that whole equation changes. And it looks like this, right? So when we get back to the question, this virgin female fly, fruit fly, had, let's do the math easily, let's say about 80-ish, 80 plus children. Of those, let's say the 38 sons, half only had daughters, half normal, which told you that the normal ones had to have the standard and the male Y, and the daughters, the sons who only had daughters had to have the mutant. And so if we look, since they came from the same mother, that means we've just figured out that the mom is heterozygous. So we come to the answer choices and we say, okay, we can eliminate C and we can eliminate D. Now we're left with these two, right? Now the question is going to be, how do we decide which one of these two answer choices it is, right? So remember, these are supposed to be, remember the question is asking us, what are the original phenotypes for the male and female who were actually mated together, right? So we know that the male has to be XY. Now the question is, are they gonna be XSY or XFY? And this is gonna be the last thing we do. And it's great because it's another point that I made at the very beginning of this video that's super subtle, but very important. And that is, you always, always, always want to stay within the passage. No matter how difficult or challenging the passage or question gets, you can't forget what the passage really has been talking about. And the whole passage has been talking about one thing, ratio traits. So if you take a second and you think about it, any male that has the mutant allele cannot make male offspring. And if they cannot make male offsprings, they cannot be the parent that led to the 38 offsprings that were sons. And so from that, you can then say that A must be our answer. There we go. All right, so I hope you enjoyed. This was a super rough cut, but please, as you're watching it and as you're learning from it, do not shy from sending me both positive and negative feedback on my video making skills, as I am trying to use this exercise to also get better myself. So good luck studying and best of luck.